Hello YouTube, this is a follow-up video to the Deload one I made 2 weeks ago because my segment ignited 2 response videos from Jeff Nippard and Alec Enkiri. Alec, who cited my name directly, and Jeff, who just spoke about the topics of Deloads as a whole. So it gives me a very good chance and opportunity to actually use their points to build upon my case, because I do think that my training methods are the most optimal for bodybuilding and hypertrophy, and that the current meta of deloading on YouTube Fitness is highly powerlifting centric and therefore much more suitable for strength athletes. So we're going to get into it today. This is a response video, and it's a response video that thankfully is based off of the work and arguments of 2 intelligent men, because both Alec and Jeff are accomplished, they have credentials if that's something that you actually care about, and also they have made very good videos about programming in the past, and they also walk the walk. They're both strong and they have good physiques. So we're not dealing with bumbling idiots, and that's always a good thing, because I've always found that the quality of a response video has almost nothing to do with the person that makes the response, and almost everything to do with the quality of the video that is used as a base for the segment. And in this case, the 2 videos I'm using are highly qualitative. So I'm plugging them in the description. I highly encourage you to watch them. They're not that long compared to what I do and what this video is going to be, because I'm going to be using their points, but I'm not going to cite them directly if not necessary. So this is what's going to happen today. We are going to discuss Deloads again in the broader schemes of hypertrophy and bodybuilding. And it's going to be, of course, very informative. I'm going to just continue down my explanation. I'm going to try and continuously provide the efforts to help you understand why I think that the methods I espouse are good, and why the opposite, the ones that stem from powerlifting, tend to be subpar. But I will not cover past points. So I'm not going to re-explain what I said in my video about Deloads or the video about the CNS, because these 2 are standalones. I will refer to them, but I'm not going to remake them, because if not, the video would be too long. So we're going to get into it. The way I segment the video is simple. We're going to start with Alec, because Alec had a more flow state approach to his response video. So he covered topics that are more basic, because he actually used my video as a direct one-to-one correlation to make his points. Jeff did something that is much more streamlined and is much more advanced in terms of using scientific concepts to explain deloads. So it's always better, in my opinion, to keep that for the end of a video, because you'll see that we're going to go crescendo in terms of complexity, and I don't want to lose you guys. It's also the reason why, unlike what I usually do, here I'm going to be reading some of the paragraphs, because I made sure that they are as simple as possible so as to make them actually digestible for you guys. I don't want to confuse you. That is not the goal of that type of video. So let's start with Alec. Alec, who is someone that I respect, have been following for years, and I do think that he has some very good ideas. But we're going to see that when it comes to deloads, at least in the realm of bodybuilding, there are a lot of issues with his methodology. First off, I must say that I am finding that Alec has a certain degree of, not necessarily condescendence, but you can clearly tell that he doesn't look up to bodybuilding. Bodybuilding to him is not something that is worthy of consideration or pursuit, because he states things like, if hypertrophy is the only training goal. And that to me is a formulation that shows that in the mind of Alec and many people who focus on strength and being overall more, again, function-oriented, aesthetics are seen as a byproduct and are seen as less worthy. The issue is that this is exactly how I perceive strength, right? It's a different of perspective. You'll see that he eventually admits to that, but I want to open to it, because bodybuilding is its own heart, and by default, hypertrophy training will always also be its own thing. So you cannot just tell people that they must pursue strength and hypertrophy is going to come as a byproduct, because that is simply downright insulting. We as bodybuilders have our own methods, and that is perfectly normal, because we have our own sport, if you even can call that a sport. Now, something to point out is that Alec had a bit of a tough time understanding why I train so much, because compared to what he trains and the hours he puts in towards actually achieving his goals, I do much more than him. It doesn't mean that I'm better than him. This is not a dick measuring contest. It only means, however, that bodybuilders tend to have to spend more time in the gym because the goal of hypertrophy tend to be more time consuming. And that's for many reasons. And for the most part, it's because we have a tendency to do more reps, we have a tendency to train more frequently, and we have also the tendency to develop more body parts. We have more body parts to cover, therefore, by default, we are going to spend more time in the gym. If you take, for example, the biceps, if a bodybuilder is going to do twice the amount of sets than a strength athlete does, or even much more than that, because many strength athletes don't train the bicep directly, then you quickly understand that if you add each and every muscle of the body to that equation, you end up with a massive amount of work that needs to be put in. We're going to discuss now whether that work needs to be put in or not, but that's for the time-consuming aspect. This is why bodybuilding training tends to be more voluminous, and it's because it's tailored towards volume. And powerlifting training and strength athletes tend to do more intensity-related work, and therefore it's also normal that they would spend less time in the gym, meaning that strength training is more effort-inducing, and bodybuilding is more time-consuming. The two are not the same. Now, it's true in a sense that I might not have to actually train that much to get the results that I get. Meaning that it is possible to look at my training and say, okay, you could do more intense reps here and slash 2 sets of this movement here, and it would be similar in terms of results. That is absolutely correct. But the reason why I don't do that, and the reason why I spend so much time in the gym, is because I like volume, meaning that it's not just something cerebral, it's not just a preference, it's something that my body responds better to. And we're all similar in that aspect. We all have a tendency to be skewed towards volume or intensity in terms of what we respond to. I have people on my channel who train for bodybuilding who do more intense sets and therefore they have to do less sets. These are just preferences, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that. What I want to mention, however, is that when Alec says that I could get the same results doing half of the work, that is simply mathematically impossible. And again, a little bit insulting, because it truly is, in a sense, looking at bodybuilding training as fluff. As if most of what we did as natural bodybuilders was just useless and we could get rid of it. That is a minimalist mindset, and the issue is that minimalism is the death of bodybuilding. If you want to end up with a completely unbalanced physique, embrace minimalism. It is the best way. Of course, that approach of minimalism functions and serves strength athletes such as Alec, and therefore it's why they embrace it. But I always found that they have a tendency afterwards to try to transfer that onto bodybuilding because they see bodybuilding as the bastard children of strength sports. So they just think that you get hypertrophy through strength, and therefore any points or efforts put towards hypertrophy or bodybuilding as a pursuit is worthless, which is why they think that doing 2 hours or an hour and a half of work, of isolation, of variations, is a waste of time. Which leads to citations and quotes such as, "It is wholly unnecessary to train that much." It is not unnecessary. If it were unnecessary, I wouldn't do it. Trust me, I have a job, I work 55 hours a week, I have a family, I have things to do, I make YouTube videos. Every single scrap of time I can save, I save. Which means that every single set I do is high quality. If I could get the same amount of gains in half the time I would, then I would. You know, it's a no-brainer. If I could shave off 50% of my training and get the same results, I would do it. But again, if you look at it from a bodybuilder standpoint, let's say that the total of my training is 50k tonnage, so 50,000 tonnage. If I cut it in half, it goes down to 25k. A powerlifter could have the same approach, but their training tonnage is, let's say, 10k. So if they cut it in half, it's 5,000k. Now, I keep saying k for some reason, just 5,000. You quickly understand here that even though we cut down both training tonnages by half, one has a much more direct impact on the ability of the body to continuously progress, and that's the bodybuilder. I lost 25,000, you only lost 5,000. So even though we both lost 50%, I lost much more than you did. This is the difference between minimalist and maximalist. As a maximalist, I cannot allow myself to do that. So that is for that introduction, and to explain also that as someone who doesn't deload, it's important to understand why I train so much, because it's an important aspect of the reason why, again, I don't need to deload like powerlifters do. I do want to point out, however, that as Alec says, I am a little bit of a dopamine addict, meaning that I take joy and pleasure from the practice of lifting weights. That is perfectly true. But I don't use that as a reason for training long hours. I don't let hedonism dictate my training practices. That would be, of course, horrendous. I can guarantee you that I do not do that. I do whatever is necessary, and that's it. When I'm done with my work, I go home. I also want to point out, and that's not a dig, it's just something that a lot of my subscribers need to hear, that for guys my height, so people who are 6 feet and above, you will find that usually you cannot get away with just downright ignoring certain body parts or doing less work. You might have to put in more work to get the similar type of results than a shorter man would get. It's something to keep in mind. I also want to mention that at some point in this segment, Alex says that for him, it's okay to take a week off because sometimes he just doesn't feel like training, and I understand that feeling, but I must also point out the fact that it's a little bit foreign to me because it's not something that I feel personally. And even if I did feel it, I would train regardless. I'm not saying that Alec is lazy, because at the end of the day, Alec is a very competitive strength athlete, so it would be a little bit stupid to say that. But that mindset of saying, well, I'll take a week off if I just don't feel like it is dangerous, because many people who lift would actually use that as an excuse to not get their work done. So it's where the disconnect also occurs. I do not understand that mindset of, I don't feel like training, therefore I don't train. To me, training is something rigid. I plan my training, and whether I want to do it or not doesn't matter. I will do it regardless. A powerlifter might be able to get away with not training for a week, because for the same logic, the amount of tonnage you will sacrifice compared to the percentage of tonnage you get in a week is almost nothing. At least it's much smaller than what I would lose. If I stop training for a week, that's 6 weeks I don't train, that's tens of thousands of pounds of tonnage. This is catastrophical. But this difference is going to get more and more obvious the more I go into his arguments. Because the second one, and it's one that I actually agree with to an extent, is that Alex says that most people, and he himself, let life dictate the deloads. And that is very flexible and intuitive. Many people are like this. They don't deload, they don't plan deloads, and they just wait for life to throw a challenge or a potential problem at them while they have to take a time off, and then they do it. I've heard many strength athletes do the exact same, and that's good and all. It might work for you, but for me, I know for a fact that if I did this, my training would suffer, because every week of my life there's something coming up. Every week of my life there's snow that is going to come through the roof, or I have to fix something in the garage, whatever. I never use that as an excuse to not train, because if I did again, I would regress. We have different needs. My body and my practice require more tonnage than yours. You can get away with that because as a minimalist, you could literally go into the gym, get your first few sets of high intensity work on the main compound movement and be done, because that's 90% of your work anyways. For me, that's 20%. It's the difference. The numbers are a little bit skewed and hyperbolic, of course, but it's to help you understand the reason why that difference in ideology is important to point out. Because the idea of letting life dictate the deloads might work for some people, but not for all. It is, of course, very good for people who are hobbyists and who have a high-stress life. Many people have a high-stress life. I don't have that, so that's also a difference. I don't travel, I stay home, I'm a monk, I'm very sedentary. So it's also a difference in sensibilities. But we do agree on one thing, and that is that the total rest approach is bad. He also agrees with that. For the most part, he would prefer people not actually take a complete week off. If possible, just work on some movement patterns. Because having to rebuild neurological adaptations makes optimal muscle fiber damage difficult. However, again, if you look at someone like Alec, for example, he can rebuild that very quickly. And at the end of the day, the only thing he lost is temporary performance that will be rebuilt extremely quickly, as I said, in a few weeks. So it doesn't really matter to someone like him. But for a bodybuilder, neurological adaptation serves one purpose and one purpose only. Always being able to push the muscle to its threshold. Meaning that if you constantly regress in terms of neurological adaptation and you constantly have to rebuild it, compared to a powerlifter who will rebuild it to top performance and be happy, we have to rebuild it to top performance, and that's when the work starts. That's when we can actually get some relevant reps done. And so it's a big problem. If you constantly go through cycles of neurological detraining, it means that on top of having to retrain that very adaptation, you have to wait to get to finally some weights that you are able to move so that you can start challenging the muscle again. Because keep in mind that neurological adaptation detrains much faster than the muscle. So let's say you have quads that can squat 3 plates. You don't train for 2 weeks. You come back, you can squat, let's say 255. This is at a point where your legs still have the ability somehow to squat around 3 plates. It's just that your nervous system just doesn't have that capacity anymore. So all the time you spend rebuilding that is time spent not challenging the muscles of the quads. They're still getting worked, but not to the extent that they could. And it might look, again, just anecdotal, but if these cycles repeat themselves throughout the years, that's actually a lot of tonnage you're leaving on the table. So that's also the difference why, for people like me and bodybuilders, this is not something that we can do. Because for someone who trains with low frequency and high intensity, not training while traveling, for example, like Alec does, is doable. Because only a few select lifts suffer, right? You have your main strength lifts, your compound lifts that you really care about. I don't know Alex personally, but I would bet my ass that he doesn't have more than 6 or 7 of these lifts. That's the pool of lifts he has to care about. I have like 25. I have a gazillion of lifts I have to take care of. Of course, they all live in the line of specificity of movement patterns, but it doesn't mean that I can just ignore some of them altogether, because for each week that Alec takes off, he might ignore 3 muscles or 3 big movers and movement patterns. For each week that I take off, I ignore at least 15 because I train much more frequently than him and I hit different muscles on each session. The amount of work I put my body through on each session is greater in terms of volume. His is greater in terms of intensity. So he might hyper focus on the shoulders, the chest, or something like this. So a lot of work is directed towards this area in particular, whereas I'll hyper focus on the entire upper body. So when he misses one session, he misses only the session for one muscle. I miss it for all of the muscles. This is why it's so dangerous to take time off as someone who wants to bodybuild. Because that loss is multiplied for us. But I also want to point out, because I don't want to scare people into not taking days off or breaks, that you don't lose size that fast. Meaning that size regresses slow. But what matters with the deload is not the size. It's never something I argued, and it's not something that Alex says I argued either. I'm just making the point. I'm not telling you to not deload so as not to lose muscle. You will barely lose any muscle. What I don't want you to lose is performance. I don't want you to regress in work capacity or performance, because then you have to rebuild the entire process, as I already explained. And for a bodybuilder, doing something like going outside and running doesn't work. I mean, running for me does jack shit. It builds my cardio, but it does nothing for my muscles. For you, Alec, who is an athlete and who runs and jumps and does shit like this, it's sport specific, but not for me. So it's not a replacement. I cannot allow myself to not do my sport specific training, which is bodybuilding training, which is all of the movements I do in my daily basis. And this is why separating the two concepts is important. It's very key. The concepts of size and strength. Too many times I hear strength athletes say that they're correlated or they go hand in hand, and all of that is true. I have never said the opposite. I also tell people to get stronger. But the difference is going to be in the ability to not pin them against one another in order to help people prioritize. Most of the time, when someone tells you that strength and size are correlated, you'll find that they always have strength as their main priority, and size is just a byproduct of it. And there is a reason for that. It's because they hold strength in higher regards than size. Size has a lower value in their heads, and you have to understand and make peace with the fact that for a natural bodybuilder, it's going to be the exact opposite. We hold strength in lower regards compared to size. Size is the goal. So we have not actually done anything to pin the concepts against one another. We are not saying that you have to pick or that you can just train for size. Of course, that's nonsense. You train for size, the strength is going to develop. But there's going to be a prioritization aspect at some point. If you refuse to accept that, or if you refuse to admit that, for example, someone like Alec prioritizes strength, then it's impossible to understand that concept. If you just think that size will just come naturally if you prioritize strength, it shows that you have an inability to understand that perspective shifts, and that a shift of perspective is a shift of training methods as well. But we'll cover that later because Alec himself says that. Now, to use this good example of a lifter, as a basis for my argument, Alec's priority, for example, is strength, which means that, of course, he developed his muscles, right? You're not just going to get stronger by virtue of neurological adaptation. At some point, the muscles have to get bigger. But it also means one thing. He develops the muscle responsible for the movements, which is why Alec's best muscles are his legs and his lats. These are his best muscles. Why? Because these are his best movements. He's incredibly strong at knee flexions. He's incredibly strong at vertical pulls. What is the result of that? He gets good size and hypertrophy in these regions. That is absolutely true, and nothing can take that away from him. But the problem is the mindset that comes with it. Because since he achieved hypertrophy from strength, it has led him to believe that it is the end-all, be-all of hypertrophy. So he will say things like, I focus on building lat strength rather than building lat size. But if you look at this quote in his words, he achieved hypertrophy as a byproduct of strength. I achieve strength as a byproduct of size. See, it's that perspective shift that is so important. You might have managed to accomplish that body of yours with these methods, but to me, this shows that if you had had methods that would have been focused on developing the body, you would have done better. And to prove to you that very point, imagine if I told you that since I have achieved strength from growing my muscles, therefore this means that growing the muscles is the most optimal way to develop strength. Powerlifters would start pelting me with plates and tell me that I'm a complete idiot, and they would be correct. It's because I wouldn't be able to look at the problem from the right perspective. So yes, size and strength go hand in hand, but you're going to have to make a choice at some point. Which one do you want the most? And once you can answer that question, you have to also admit that if there is a priority that actually occurs, then this must mean that one method is going to be more beneficial for one or the other. Example, which do you think build more muscle? 1 rep maxes on squats or doing something like 20 reps Widowmakers? It's going to be the Widowmaker every single time by a large margin. Why? You accumulate more tonnage. This is an absolutely extreme example, but it's an example that is very important to take because the Widowmaker would build less strength. You would build more strength doing something like squat every day for 1 rep max with varying intensities and percentages than doing Widowmakers once a week. So again, there's a clear divide between size and strength. And what is the divide? It's the method. And the method here is the rep range. We're going to get into that also later. But it's, again, absolutely important to get because size and strength are complementary, but both values don't rise together at the same pace. One will grow faster because you prioritize it. If you were to picture that in your head, a lot of people think of size and strength as 2 columns that are side by side. I don't like think about it like this. What I would prefer you to think of is 2 columns that are stacked on one another. And whichever column is at the bottom is the one you don't actually care about. And whichever is on top is the one that you care about. So you're going to grow the one that you don't care about, and by default, it's going to raise the one that you care about. For powerlifters, this means that this is strength and this is size. For bodybuilders, you take those blocks and you shift them. Because too many times people will show you the 2 columns and they will tell you, well, my strength is doing this and my size is doing this. So this must mean that the best way to grow size is to grow strength. But they won't understand that if I just flip those 2 columns, I could make the exact same point. My size is going up, so my strength is going up. You understand where I'm coming from. Most of the time, one of the 2 is going to go up faster than the other, and that is the one you prioritize. Now, this I can prove. I can actually prove with an example that I'm going to present to you right now using Alec and myself as guinea pigs. Look at Alec and look at me. Which one of us 2 is stronger? Alec, by a large margin. He's stronger than me on every single lift imaginable. I don't think there's even a single lift that I can beat him at. And that is taking into account that I'm much bigger than him and much heavier than him. Now, this has been established. He is stronger. He's the better athlete. All right. Step 2. Which one of us is bigger? This is the moment where I take my dick and I slap it on the table. I hope that you don't mind me doing that, but hopefully you can accept the idea and concept that the bigger one out of the 2 is me. I outweighed him by almost 50 pounds. Now, of course, I'm taller than him, and therefore I have a bigger frame and more space for muscles, but I can also tell you that as someone who's 6 feet with narrow shoulders, I could see a world where I would focus entirely on performance and be around 180 or 190. There is a reason why I'm 210. It's because I prioritize size, and this is the proof, which also means that if Alec wanted, he could be heavier. He could prioritize size, but he would have to sacrifice pound for pound strength for that, something he's not willing to do, just like I'm not willing to sacrifice my aesthetics and my hypertrophy to be able to get stronger. This is something that, again, is up to perspective and up to personal preference. So, this also means that strength athletes get size, and that is something that's undeniable, but since they get size without even trying, they shouldn't be giving advice to other people as to how to do it themselves, because they are, again, not really looking at size as a variable to actually increase. It just increases. They might be doing hypertrophy blocks, but again, what is the purpose of an hypertrophy block? To have bigger biceps? No, to get stronger down the line. So that's the reason. But also is the reason why people, even very intelligent people like Alec, tend therefore to assume that their method is the best for both worlds. They think that their method is the best for both strength and size. And it's now so deeply ingrained in the mind of powerlifters on this platform that even me saying that is going to raise some eyebrows, because some people have just, again, accepted that as fact, and that's not true. And that's the reason why I'm here today to tell you that there are better methods for hypertrophy. Because if you accept that there could be a better method for hypertrophy, you have to start thinking in terms of, okay, therefore, what type of method is going to be better? And this is where we start talking about Deloads. This is why I brought up the topic of Deload. It's not just Deload we're talking about. It's global methodology of training. That is the actual interesting part. It's the reason why this video is so long, is because Jeff and Alec brought up great points that allow me to, again, further my thesis. But just to finish with this analogy and the description of why just following strength is not going to get you size, I also want to point out that someone like Alec, again, has very strong hypertrophic benefits from his strength on certain lifts. But I must point out that he also has glaringly weak points. For example, his chest and his biceps, or his long arm of the triceps. Again, this is not a dig. He's a strength athlete, so who cares? Aesthetics is not his goal. But the reason why he has these weak points is because he is not as dedicated to lifts that target these actual muscles. For example, he's not a big fan of bench press, or he doesn't dip as much as he pulls, for example, because he doesn't care for it for as much. This leads to a lagging chest. But this also leads to more space in the program to do what he likes. And now this is when I offer to you a perspective shift. Alec, and anyone who trains minimalism with only a select amount of lifts, imagine if what you put in, the work you put in for your favorite movements, imagine if you had to do the same for every single muscle group. Imagine if there was no other choice. Every muscle group should be treated as a priority. Now look at your training load. You would most likely be training as much as I am, because now your scope of priority has extended. You cannot scope down. And therefore, it also means that you cannot escape the work, and also that the type of deloads that would work for a strength athlete suddenly doesn't work anymore, because the amount of fatigue you have to deal with and the amount of management of the fatigue you have to actually put in place just doesn't compute anymore. And this is a little bit of a mindfuck, because you could tell me, well, NH, you train more than him. You do more volume and tonnage than him. So this means that it would double justify taking a week off. No, it doesn't. But I'm going to get into that when we start talking about Jeff Nippard's argument. Because I want to continue with Alex, with apostrophe S. Because his video is a very good introduction, since he continues his segment by talking about the central nervous system. Now, I already made a video about the central nervous system 2 days ago, I think. So I'm not going to cover that again, all right? If you want to hear about that topic in particular, go. I'm just going to cover some points that Alec made because they're interesting. So first off, Alec argues that you cannot tell if the bucket will be at 100%. This relates to my analogy and metaphor of the buckets, where I tell you that each muscle has a bucket. It's the recovery bucket that goes from 0 to 100. 100 being fully recovered, 0 being trashed beyond belief, where the muscle has no function anymore. What I said in my Deload video was that, optimally speaking, you want the bucket to be at 100% before you train again. However, it's not a necessity, meaning that if your bucket is at 90%, you still have enough function to spare to be able to empty that bucket, which is fatigue accumulation, and then let the muscle recover. That is a big distinction between strength athletes and bodybuilders. We do not need peak performance. We can train with, again, a chipped performance, a slightly moderately lowered performance, and it doesn't really make a big difference as long as we still get quality tonnage. Which is why also the practice of deloading for the sake of always being at 100% is not necessary. Now, I understand that the bucket shit is confusing to some people, so his point was a little bit vague. I don't know if I misrepresented his argument. If I did, I apologize. It's what I understood. Now, as I said, it's okay since you don't need the bucket to be full to perform. But, and it's a point that he made that's very important and interesting, he pointed out the fact that if you follow what I just told you, and you just train when you are at 94% and 92%, at some point, these small points of fatigue can creep up on you. They can accumulate, right? You constantly refuse to go to 100%, and you train and you train and you train, and maybe one day you miss 2 points of recovery, the other day 4, the other day 6, but these pile up, and then you get to a point where you're under-recovered, the muscle is too fatigued. And that is a good point, that is absolutely possible. The problem is that, then again, if we look at this stipulation and if we look at this hypothesis, this would just mean that this is poor recovery management. It's not necessarily that the practice of bodybuilding deload I espouse is bad, it's just that it's not as absolutist as a normal deload, meaning that a normal deload will guarantee you're fully recovered. Mine doesn't. Mine requires you to actually pay attention, meaning that it's going to be up to you to not shoot yourself in the foot and be in touch with the body, which does make it less accessible. I've never said that novices should train like this. The good thing is that for the most part, novices don't need to deload, so it sort of works out in the end. Because remember, and that's a point that I want to make because I hear too many people repeat it, deload and deloads in general isn't the only way to get rid of fatigue. I see so many people saying, oh, if you don't deload, then you accumulate fatigue. But deloading is just one method. A deload is just one way to take a rest and to let fatigue go back to zero. You understand that there are other methods, right? If you do a split where you do a knee flexion on Tuesday and another one on Friday, there's Wednesday and Thursday to recover. You could still be training on these days, but the fatigue accumulation for the muscle of the quads and of the glutes and the posterior chain would still go down. That is also fatigue management. It's also a way to flush out fatigue. You don't need to do nothing or to just do submaximal loads to deload. And if you don't understand that, you can close the video and go, I don't know, suck on a lollipop or something, because it's all the crux of the argument. My point is that it was never necessary to do deloads the way powerlifters or strength athletes do it. There are other methods of managing fatigue, and they tend to be more optimal because they are more precise for people who need precision. For example, with muscle splits, it's the reason why I program muscle splits, is because they allow for the flushing of fatigue by looking at the muscle. Now, of course, the counter-argument that you hear when you point that out is people will tell you, well, it's nice and all that you look at the fatigue of each muscle and you manage that, but what about CNS? What about the global fatigue of the body? I made a video about that. It's in the pinned comment, so I'm not going to say it again. I debunk this argument in the pinned comments. You can go and you can watch it if that is the question or the counter-argument you want to offer. Because a proper muscle split also lets the CNS rest even if you train. I want to point out also that all of the people who defend deloads, and I'm not saying Alec in general, it's just the people who gravitate around that type of mindset, that tend to have and espouse a confirmation bias. Meaning that they deload, they don't have any CNS fatigue, or they break plateaus, or they outperform, and therefore they conclude that deloads are good. This is a confirmation bias because, again, it's looking at a potential event in the future, doing something preemptively to prevent it, not experiencing said event, and then telling to yourself, okay, well, this must mean that what I'm doing is what is preventing the event from happening. For example, if I told you that doing this prevents you from getting cancer, and you did it, and every day of your life you did it once a day like this, and you never got cancer, and you told me, NH, you're a genius, you prevented my cancer. No, I didn't. You might not have gotten cancer in the first place. This is a confirmation bias. Just because you do this doesn't mean that the event that should have occurred, that didn't occur, was prevented by this. This is what I mean. It's a point I made in the video with my analogy about the big bad wolf. I want to point out also at tendons accumulation in terms of fatigue with a quote. I think this one is from Nippard actually, who says that tendons accumulate damage without you noticing, so deloads are good. This is the same thing. It's taking something that apparently is unseeable, unfillable, like tendon fatigue that somehow accumulates out of nowhere and you don't feel it, and then saying, see, when you deload, there's no tendon fatigue, but you just described tendon fatigue as something you can feel. So how do you know that you avoided tendon fatigue via deloads if you cannot feel tendon fatigue? That is the same absurdist mindset that I reproach to people who push deloads. They are afraid of something they've never experienced once. Right? If you shot yourself in the foot one day and you experience CNS fatigue and then you deloaded, maybe you have a point, but even then I could tell you that what you did was just poor fatigue management and you could have not deloaded and just be smarter with your training. This is sort of the point of the type of deloads that I do. And my problem with this too is that with deload weeks, even if you actually do work during the week, and with that type of blanket rest periods, it's sort of a cop-out, meaning that instead of allowing the novice to actually manage fatigue on a day-to-day basis and get good at it, deloads are just a way to make sure that they never have to actually do it. Because a deload will flush out all fatigue. And it's something that novices love to bring up. If you tell a novice that deloads are bad, they'll tell you, well, I took a week off and I came back and I got a PR, so it must mean that deloads are good. No, not necessarily. It just means that they allowed you to perform at 100%. But if we're talking about total tonnage accumulation and muscle building, yeah, it's subpar. And it's tough to argue against that again because you lost a week of work. And unlike what Alec might tell you, a week of work is a lot of work, especially if you take weeks off several times during the year, right? If you take a week off every 6 weeks or 12 weeks, yeah, that's a lot of work you're not doing. And throughout the years, this accumulates. As I said, for someone like Alec, who does a minimal amount of work for a maximal amount of performance, it doesn't matter. But for a bodybuilder, it does. I can tell you that. For me, every day that I miss is a tragedy because it's a lot of tonnage that I cannot make up. So I cannot allow myself to miss too many days. But this only becomes true if you start training with high frequency. Because of course, if you train 6 days a week, with the load that I personally have to train with, it becomes a problem. I would also like to point out, however, that if you only train 3 days a week and you take 1 day off here and there to deload, well, you only train 3 days a week to start with, so you missed 30% of your training. All of these are percentages to keep in mind because they matter. Work matters. The workload that you put in matters. It's a little bit of a troll argument to make, but I do remember Alex saying that calf raises don't work for calf growth. This is sort of what I mean, right? There's a certain degree of powerlifting and strength mindset that has a tendency to negate muscle building altogether and to look at it as something that's a little bit even mythical or something that is not what most people think it is. Well, I'll tell you what muscle building is. You train the muscle, you accumulate fatigue, you let it rest, and you train it again. That's muscle building. Every single muscle can be grown if you apply that method, and if you cut the cycle of recovery all the time by not allowing yourself to train because of deloads, then you will find that maybe, yes, maybe the muscle will not grow. So that is for that point of the discussion. This is why I absolutely encourage novices not to deload, because novices need to learn how to manage fatigue, and deloads prevent them with blanket rest periods. Now, there are people who absolutely need deloads because of other stressors in their life, and I accept that, I already said it, but they're rare. And for the most part, I think that a lot of the time, people who tell you that if they don't deload, they suffer problems like, for example, tendon pains, it's not because of the fact that they don't deload, it's because of the fact that they don't know how to train. The issue is that, of course, these people will take a week off, they will get their tendon pain in check, and they'll think, oh, the deload worked. Yeah, but it might just be covering up for another issue in your training. You might do a type of training that is too intensive on the tendon and too light on the muscles, but you'll never actually understand that or notice that because the deloads are always there to save your ass. But keep in mind that if you're already undertraining the muscles because your tendons are in pain and you take a week off, tendon fatigue goes here, muscle fatigue was already here. It wasn't that high. So you went to zero and you stagnated there, okay? Because you can only recover from muscle fiber damage. So be careful with that type of things. You have tendon pain, fix something else. The deload is not a fix. The deload is a band-aid. You're not actually fixing the issue. You're just taking painkillers to make sure that it doesn't happen again. It's not proper practices. And I know that Alex didn't like the semantical appellation proper practice, I'm sorry, there are proper practices for bodybuilding, there are proper practices for strength training. If I told you to get stronger at squats by doing 30 reps all the time on squats, you would tell me, hey, that's not proper practices for strength. I agree, and it's the reason why I say that deloads are not proper practices for hypertrophy. And so that's what I already said. And to finish with the CNS, I want to say that the relationship between the CNS, the muscle and tendon fatigue, is skewed by weekly deloads, which is what I already explained. Meaning that you have all of these columns of fatigue and you take a week off, so you flush them all out, which makes it much more difficult to then actually keep an eye on the relationships that they have with one another. So it's mismanagement in a sense. It's not actually looking at each variable, is just using blanket rest periods to reset every single variable to 0 and saying, okay, this is the way to go. Well, no, I already explained why. All of these variables were not at the same level. So muscle fiber damage most likely suffered from it because it was the one that went to 0 and then was not challenged again. And that's going to be that for this segment. Now, I want to quickly finish with that CNS thing with an allegory that I really liked from Alec, but we have different perspectives on it, so it's the reason why it makes it interesting. Alec says that the CNS is king, and therefore he will tell you, well, CNS is king, so you have to look at CNS. You cannot allow yourself to program after muscle fiber damage. You cannot look at muscle fatigue to program, because you need to look at the most important thing, and the most important thing in the kingdom is CNS. If you don't look at CNS and you get your CNS fried, you can't use the muscles anymore. Right? If the king dies, the citizens don't have a guidance or a leader anymore. So everything goes down the drain. Well, that is nice and all, but I want to offer to you a different perspective. To me, a proper king is one that sacrifices himself for his subjects. This also means that he has greater strength and greater capacity for resilience, meaning that he can suffer greater pains. And if you look at the CNS, at least my understanding of it sort of correlates and it sort of actually matches, meaning that your CNS has much greater capacity for work and expenditure than the muscles. And it's a little bit tough to argue against that. You can't argue with me that your legs have more work capacity than the CNS. Every muscle is a subject of the king, of the CNS. So by default, the CNS is the most endurant portion when we look at training variables. Meaning that if you constantly manage fatigue with CNS in mind, you are never going to actually have the ability to target the muscles as effectively as you could. It's something a point I made in the CNS video. There is no point in sparing the CNS if this leads to poor muscle stimulus as well. There is no point for a king's existence if he has no subjects, or if his subjects suffer, or if his subjects are not actually thriving. The reason why strength athletes get to have that type of mindset is because for them, CNS is both CNS is the end-all be-all in reality, because what they care about is the impulse of the nervous system. The muscles are just, again, sacks of flesh attached to the body that are going to allow them to expand our power. But it's not the same for us bodybuilders. For us, the muscles is what we care about the most. So we are not going to have the same relationship with the CNS. And you could argue that we're both humans, so we absolutely have to have the exact same view and mindset on the CNS, because every single human has the same CNS. The CNS is what makes the muscle work. Yes, I absolutely agree with that. But this is, again, a question of perspective. We, bodybuilders, grow the CNS to grow the muscles, not the other way around. The only point of the CNS for bodybuilders is to activate those muscles. So the way we're going to think about it is, how can I make it so that the CNS is always fresh enough to activate the muscles? Not, how can I make it so that the muscles are always fresh enough to activate the CNS, which is something that a strength athlete would do. You will see that these inversions and these perspective shifts occur all the time, because at the end of the day, as I said, Jeff and Alec are capable people. If you follow their advice, you will get gains. But the points that we argue are seen again from a different standpoint. We have the same lingo, but we don't use it the same way. We speak the same language, but we use it for different purposes. That is the point of this video, because these are the distinctions that are the toughest to make. It's the reason why so many people still train for aesthetics with strength practices, because they're very similar. They're so similar that they look like brothers. They look like twin brothers. But as you all know, you can actually distinguish between twin brothers if you have enough experience with one or the other. I have ample experience with the size twin, so when you show me the strength twin and you say, oh, it's the same guy, I'm like, no, they look similar, but they're different. They have different things inside, they have different essence. So that's for the CNS point. I'm not going to spend too much more time on it because I already made a video about that. Now, let me just check the time and see how we are. Not so bad. All right. So I want to wrap up this segment and this response to Alec with what we agree on. Because I agree with Alec that you cannot blame Deloads for people who decide to do way too much work prior to it. It's a point that he actually made, where he told me and he told his viewers, rightfully so, that if someone is going to do like way too much work before a deload week, which means a ton of junk volume, and then have the deload week as, again, a band-aid, that's not the fault of the deload week. It's just that the guy doesn't know how to use the deload week. Likewise, if someone doesn't do enough work and then deloads and gets detrained and lose benefits because of it, that's also not the fault of the deload week. It's his fault. I absolutely agree with that. But this mindset also applies to my methods, right? Because I've seen people in the comments saying, well, NH, with your method, someone could get injured. Yes, but that's not my method's fault. It's poor fatigue management. Likewise, if someone never lets the buckets recover and they just train on a tired muscle times and times again, that's not my fault, that's their fault. It's because they're not using proper fatigue management. Deloads, powerlifting deloads, and bodybuilding deloads are tools. If you don't know how to use a tool, it's not the tool's fault, it's your fault. If I give you a hammer and you bump your noggin with it, you're not going to blame the hammer, it's your fault. Because the issue is poor programming practices. And that is my point. The issue is that most people who use powerlifting deloads engage in them. I'm not saying that deloads are bad. I'm saying that the people who use deloads are bad. That is the point. The issue here is that if the practice is sound, but the people who espouse it aren't, then the practice becomes bad for them. And now, I want to make clear that it's not that the problem is with powerlifters doing deloads. The problem is that when you take a proper and sound concept like a deload that works with a powerlifter and you give it to a bodybuilder, now it doesn't work. Now the perspective just doesn't align. Now we have two different beasts, two different individuals and animals that are being presented with the same method that works with one and not with the other. The only way to argue with that is to tell me that, again, bodybuilding is just the bastard child of powerlifting. So what a powerlifter does, a bodybuilder can do with minor details and it's the same results. That is not true. Right? I will never accept that view of the world because it's simplistic and it's also downright insulting. I do not accept that. We are not the subjects, we're not the vassals of powerlifters. We grew side by side. There used to be a time where bodybuilding and powerlifting were holding hands. We were developing together. We suffered from PD users and now we suck, but it's not a reason to be entirely submissive to powerlifters. Yes, they did a much better job at developing programming practices, but it doesn't mean that we have to espouse them just because it's there. Just because they developed a technology that is much more advanced than us, doesn't mean that we have to just espouse it. We can take it and tweak it, and that's something that I'm trying to do as much as possible. And this leads us to the concept of the lowest common denominator. Alec is aware of that because he programs for clients. We never program with in mind the fact that the person that we might be programming for is stupid. And it's something that's incredibly important because if you stop doing that and you constantly tell your programs or designs after someone who might be too stupid to understand them and therefore gets hurt, you make shit programs. And it's been proven times and times again. Companies that always are going to produce products to make sure that they have no liability make shitty products because the more restrictions you put on the product, the less usable it is because the less freedom is involved. So it's something that I'm sure Alec will agree with here. This type of argument of saying, well, this could get someone hurt is not receivable. You have the responsibility of knowing how to use the programs or concepts that we present to you guys for training. Yes, my methods of deloads can lead to fatigue accumulation and overuse injuries if you don't know what you're doing, but that is true for 100% of deload strategies, so it's not receivable. Once that's been established, we can start talking about intent, because Alec brings up the concept of undulating loads, where he explains that when you deload, you have, for the most part, to apply undulating loads, and that even outside of deloads, for fatigue management, it's always better to go about it this way. And this, to me, is when we can really discuss again that concept of intent, because it's an intent that only functions with strength athletes for the most part. It's a great intent, but it's one that's tailored towards your practice and what you do. A minimalist would allow that type of variable. They would allow that load to undulate because, in his case, it applies to something like a strength hook. And in the case of the strength hook, progression is going to be expected. So losing stability to allow for upwards movements is optimal. Long story short, and to make this simple, it's perfectly valid for a powerlifter to deadlift 400 pounds knowing it's only 80% because he has his eyes on the 100%. It's a building block to get to a certain degree of strength. It's a peaking process. Bodybuilders don't peak. This is why this mindset doesn't work. This mindset of saying, oh, just undulate the load. Yeah, but again, you have to understand that the only reason why you allow the load to dip so low, quote unquote, further away from top intensities is because you expect to hit high intensities. We don't. So if you can do this and go here, we can't, because we'll never go here. So it makes much more sense for us to do this, to not undulate at all. It's the concept of tonnage stability that I preach. We do not have the same goals. So for you, what you consider to be a sacrifice worth making because it's going to result in strength, after a while, for us, is just a sacrifice because we don't care about the strength that you would care about. So we're sacrificing something for nothing. It's the same with deloads for the type of people who are going to deload and then nothing happens because they deload as if they were going to peak, but they never peak. That's an example that I used. It's again all about intent. Now, this is why losing stability for us is not something that we want to do as a bodybuilder. Strength work only serves to accumulate as much high quality tonnage as possible to allow the other movement patterns to progress. And this is the end all be all of why I prescribe such stability. Now, if we're going to again look at the question of loads and fatigue management as associated with undulating loads, for example, Alec said that it has a lot to do with the sets and rep ranges. So he accepts and admits the premise that the way you are going to manage fatigue has a ton to do with the way the program is scheduled. And this is why, again, proof is right there in the words that he said, that you are not going to be able to use the same methods for bodybuilding or powerlifting because you're going to have entirely different sets and rep ranges. I guarantee you that if you slapped Alec's program and my program side to side, it's two different woods. I do more sets than him, I do more reps than him. And the issue is that a lot of the time, minimalists would say, well, my method is the best and your method is overkill, so let's slash yours. Well, imagine if I did that to your program and I told you, well, you're wrong and maximalism is the way to go. So how about I add sets to your shit? Well, you'll tell me no, because it's going to make it impossible for me to maintain what I need to be intense and to progress with my undulating loads, etc. And I can tell you the same thing. Your methods applied to my programs for my intents and my goals make it impossible for me to achieve set goals because you are applying methods that work for your program and not mine, and you're trying to justify that by saying that my program doesn't work in the first place. Something that Alec said at the start of the video, where he told me and he told his viewers that we could slash my program by 50%, which is again mathematically impossible and also insulting. And I know that Alec didn't mean to do that, but people and powerlifters and strength athletes have to keep that in mind. When you talk to a bodybuilder, most of the time you're going to be demeaning because you take us as apes. You think that we're just apes playing with our fishies, with sticks, and you're the carrier of the flame that is going to teach us how to wipe our asses. And you're right, there used to be a time where this was right, but it's not the case anymore. We're evolving as well. We're humans as well. And we're making our own methods and trying to build back. We're trying to regain all the time we lost because of pro bodybuilders and all the drug use that, yes, made our methodologies completely useless and retarded in the literal sense of a retard of time. We missed 50, 60 years of progression because of that stuff. But as I said, it's not a reason to just espouse your methods, and it's not a reason for you to act condescendingly towards us. We are big boys, we're going to figure out by ourselves, but the only way we can actually do that is if we emancipate, if we stop just following what you say by the letter, because what you say for the most part, Alec, and for any minimalist out there, tends to be a load of crap for practice because it just don't work. Doing less and less and less for bodybuilding just don't work. And I'm not saying that you have to do a ton of exercises, but you will always do more work than a powerlifter because the type of result that you want is not the same. You don't aim for strength. Now, to continue in that same vein, this is the something that I personally call the numerical divide between size and strength, because it's an expression of different intents. So you can actually quantify the difference between size and strength training just looking at reps and sets. I know many people ask, what is the difference between size and strength training? Well, that's it. It's numbers. It's literally that. Numbers that do what? That express an intent. That's what numbers do. Each program tells a story. And what tires me a bit is that on YouTube Fitness, every time I read a program, the story I read is the same one. It's the story of powerlifting every single time. Even with bodybuilding programs nowadays, or aesthetic or size programs, every time I look at them, I'm like, I've read that before. It's taken straight from the powerlifting book. I've seen that page. And the only reason why I'm able to tell you that it's, again, a powerlifting story is because of the rep range, of the exercise selection, of the frequency. All of that matters. You can tell if a program is a powerlifting or a bodybuilding program based entirely on numerical values. That is the truth. That is something that Alec knows. But the issue is that he has come to understand or to believe that his equation is the one that solves all, when in reality it only solves his problem and my equation solves my problem. Now, an example that I have for you when it comes to that numerical divide is that Alec, and I keep writing Alex and saying Alex, I'm sorry, it's Alec. Alec can ignore heavy lifting for months, and it's something that he said, and still get to 90% of his all-time best in a matter of weeks. And that is 100% believable. I'm sure that he's capable of doing that. So we're going to use that as the basis to continue this argument. Okay, if we look at that, we can now then surmise that if we compute that 10% loss that he experiences of performance over every single movement pattern plus variations, it's going to get greatly magnified. For example, if I were to look at Alec's program and he has a certain number of lifts and he can ignore some of them because he knows he can get them back quick. Imagine if now it's not one movement that he ignores, it's 6. Now that 6 movements he has to get back to. He gets back to 90%. That 10% might not look like much, but multiplied by 6, it's 60%. 60% of what? The top range of intensity. That is what happens when you take a powerlifting principle and you apply it to bodybuilding. It gets catastrophically worse because everything in bodybuilding is bigger. It's not just our bodies, it's also the way we program. So what is 10% in your program that's like this, in my program like this, is 60%. And now it's a massive loss that I have to make up for. Again, I'm not going to repeat myself, but it's the reason why minimalism and slashing in bodybuilding simply doesn't function. Because that 10% loss over every single movement pattern makes you understand why bodybuilders cannot look like that. Stuff like transient reduction in loads for bodybuilders will occur in terms of tonnage when you go up in weight for an evolving rep range and lose sets or lose reps. Meaning that while strength athletes apply this principle via intensity, bodybuilders will do it via volume. This is looping back to the concept of undulating loads. I understand we're touching on difficult topics. It's not that hard to understand. Pretty much the topic at hand here is that Alec argues that if you want to auto-regulate, you can only auto-regulate by undulating the load. So you're going to have a range of from 400 pounds to 500 pounds on the deadlift, and you undulate to manage fatigue. The more weight you use, the more you're going to get fatigued. So the more fatigue you accumulate, the less you use, the less fatigue. And that is how you actually manage it. That is 100% accurate. The issue is that Alec says that this is the only way to auto-regulate, and that is simply not true. You can do it the exact same way with reps and sets, and that is the way bodybuilders should do it. It's the reason why I never preach intensity variations in the programs I make. I preach sets and reps variations. It's for a reason. There is a design behind that. There is a reason behind that design. And that reason is very simple, is that you can manipulate tonnage and therefore fatigue pretty much whichever way you want. And for bodybuilders, it's the reason why I chose, meaning that while strength athletes apply this principle via intensity, as I said, when they manipulate the actual load on the bar, bodybuilders do it via volume. We don't touch the weight on the bar, we touch the amount of reps and sets we do with the weight. It results in the exact same thing. Alec says, auto-regulation dictates fluctuations in load, not fluctuations in sets and reps. And the question I have for you, my friend, is why? Who decided that? And can you explain to me why logically? Because again, if we look at raw numbers and numerical values, that makes absolutely no sense. The result is the same. A manipulation of tonnage, that's it. It's just the load that changes. You do your work with 400 pounds, I do it, or 400 to 500 pounds, so that's your range. I do it with 420 pounds all the time, but I can do it for 3 sets or 1 set, for 4 to 8 reps. That is my range. It's still tonnage that moves. The only difference is that mine provides stronger stability, yours provides stronger progression, because we have different goals. That is the point. And it's a good thing. We have different goals and we get different results. We don't want to have the same methods, because then it would either produce subpar powerlifters or subpar bodybuilders. And for the most part on this platform, what we see is subpar bodybuilders. People who have put all their points into strength and then who wonder why they have a shit physique. Or they wonder why their strength is super high but their physique is just not up to par. It's simple. You've been training for strength. You've been espousing methods that you didn't know were time-stamped strength, and you thought, well, that's the optimal way to get bigger. Bullshit. And then these people say, well, I have bad genetics for size. No, you just don't train for size properly. So anyone who auto-regulates using the load on the bar falls into that category. You would be better off using evolving rep ranges, because what powerlifters do through load management, aka intensity, I, and bodybuilders in general, do through reps and sets management, aka volume. We manipulate fatigue, we just use different variables to do it. It's the reason why now you understand why so many people tell you that volume is super important for bodybuilding. And that is quickly misconstrued by people who do 15 sets of 400 reps. That's not what it means. It means that the key variable to manipulate for bodybuilding is volume, not that you have to ignore intensity and frequency. For powerlifters, it's different, it's intensity. And anyone who argues against that, you're wrong. If you're telling me that the most important value for powerlifting is not intensity, then you don't understand performance. Because if you don't look at intensity as your number one king variable, then you're not going to be able to actually perform on a 1 rep max. And that is something that Alec would absolutely agree with me. I'm not saying that powerlifters don't look at volume or frequency, but it's a byproduct. It's something that comes afterwards. So they get volume through their practice of intensity, which then creates what? Muscle gains. Does it mean that looking at intensity as the number one variable for muscle gains is optimal? No, it's something that I already explained. It's a different perspective, because at the end of the day, the result is the same. If I do 2 reps instead of 4, I lifted less load. So that's load management that happened through reps and sets. And this is why, to answer Alec's question, I titled the video, "This is why I never deload." It's because I don't do it the way you do it. It was, in a sense, a joke or a pun, or whatever you want to call it, an absurdist take on the problem at hand. I deload plenty, but I do it with sets and reps management, which you say is not a way to properly deload. And I say that you're full of shit. Again, respectfully, I like you, dude, but I do fully believe that you have spent so much time programming for strength that you have started to believe that programming for size doesn't even exist. And I think that it's proven by your video, and it's proven by the fact that you didn't understand the title. The title was a dig. It was a way to say that I don't follow your methods, right? I invented my own way of deloading. An invention that, by the way, is not coming from me. Bodybuilders of the past used to do the exact same thing. Intensity was important, but it was never the key variable. And this is why I never deload. I don't do it the way you do it, because people with different goals should have different methods. And I'm going to end the Alec segment with a quote directly from him that proved that everything I just presented is correct, that he knows it in a sense subconsciously, but that he hasn't been able to fully identify yet. Let me say, and let me quote that man. Alec said that at the end of the day, all of the things that we discuss, all of these semantics, all of these different approaches are ideological differences between bodybuilding training and performance training. And he follows that up by saying, personally, I could care less about bodybuilding. And the question I have for you then is, why do you give advice to people who might want size? And I'm not saying you do it, but if you make a video telling me that the way I do deload is improper, and then you follow that up by saying that you don't really care about bodybuilding, well then clearly your argument is poison to start with. You don't care about the practice, so why exactly would you wade in, and what is your experience or knowledge base when it comes to that very practice? It would be quite insulting if I did the same to you with strength, so why do you allow yourself to do it for bodybuilding? Well, it's not because you're a bad person, it's because the platform as a whole is highly skewed towards powerlifting, so you have the high ground and you don't even realize that you're punching up, that you're punching down, you're punching with a high advantage on me, but that advantage is soon going to dissipate because I'm working towards helping people understand that yes, there are better methods than the one being offered right now on the platform. So that is for that. And I know that Alec is a big advocate of that as well. I propose that everyone stay in their lane. People who train for aesthetics will program for aesthetics, and people who train for strength will program for strength. We can go to each other's home once in a while and eat cake and drink coffee together and have a good time. We can call each other brothers, because I personally believe that Alec is my brother. We are lifters, we are brothers in iron, but we do different things and we're going to do them with different methods. And that is the way to go if we want both practices to shine and to prevail in the future. So to quickly conclude with that segment, do you need to deload? Yes. Do you need to deload like a powerlifter would? No. And that was the point of the first video I made about deloads. Now, we are going to move on to Jeff. The reason why I kept Jeff for the end of the segment is because he is a very scientific boy, and therefore he promotes concepts and topics that take a lot of time to explain. So I would highly encourage you to watch his video. It's less than 10 minutes. It's not based off of my video, so it's more generalistic. It's going to give you a good example and good idea of what's going on. And actually, you don't even have to watch the full video. Just watch the first 2 minutes. In the first 2 minutes is contain every single thing that I'm going to be speaking of against. Because Jeff is also someone who has tremendous strength, tremendous knowledge, great intellect, and a good physique, but who is also powerlifting centric. And it's something that you're going to notice as well. It was the same with Alec. These people are agents of powerlifting. They are trying to steal your bicep gains and trade them for deadlift gains, and you should never let them do that. So let's see what Jeff had to say about this entire deload topic. Jeff starts his segment by saying that most bodybuilders are hung up on the go hard or go home mentality, and that is because his big shtick and his big idea is that you need to train smart, not train hard, and bodybuilders, because of course we are stinking baboons, we only know how to train hard and to just, again, smash our heads with rocks. And of course, this gets no results. I personally disagree with that idea. That's not true. Meaning that I believe that most bodybuilders think that's what they're doing. Most bodybuilders think that they're working hard. When in reality, they do a ton of junk volume, which is something that every single program I focused or I reviewed from a pro bodybuilder demonstrates. They always do a shit ton of work for nothing. And they tend to engage in masochistic training practices. For example, 20 reps on the leg press, then puke in a bucket. Yeah, that's nothing, and it's garbage for hypertrophy. It's very theatrical. Normies love that shit because it's hardcore, but it does nothing. That's what Jeff calls working hard. It's a misconstruction. That's not what working hard is, but that is the image, sadly, that bodybuilders have on this platform. We are, again, low bro dumbasses that don't know how to train and just grab dumbbells and do cheat curls for 3 hours. That sadly is a reality that I'm working towards breaking down. So that's for the introduction. This only demonstrates that bodybuilding on YouTube Fitness has terrible PR, and bodybuilders are seen again as the baboons that they are. He follows that up by saying that The issue with that type of mindset of working too hard is that the gains happen when you go home and rest. First off, that's a platitude, meaning that I am sick and tired of hearing this. It's like the diet is 90% of the results shit. No, it's not true. It's a platitude. It's very palatable for people who don't understand complex concepts, but here I'm going to explain to you why it makes no sense. It's because it's a chicken and egg situation. Which one is most important, the recovery or the training? If you tell me the recovery, you're wrong. Why? Because the recovery cannot occur without the training. Fatigue accumulation is the key to progression. If you remove fatigue, progression doesn't exist. So you cannot look at it from that lens. It's just not a proper way to approach the concepts. The gains happen when you train. They actualize and materialize when you rest. That is a better way to think about this. Because the issue is that if you present it like this, many people are going to think, oh, then recovery is the most important fact or the most important aspect. No, it's like if I told you the most important aspect of the human body or the most vital thing to obtain as a human is oxygen. Well, I mean, yeah, you're correct, because if I remove the oxygen, you die. But do you think that this produces interesting concepts? No, it's reductionist, because it's absolutist, and it's based off of a false pretense. So, not a good way to approach the topic to start with. Because while recovery is key for muscle gains, you can only recover from what you've done. And that is something I pointed out with deloads. Many people deload from, I don't know, they bump their toe on a table. They don't have accumulated enough fatigue to justify the length of the deload. So why do they deload? Well, they don't know. I don't know either. It's because they deload from nothing. Because they've been told recovery is key, so they lost sight of training. It's the reason why I always tell you guys, training is number one. Training is the number one priority and what you have to pay attention to. If you over-recover, and yes, you can over-recover, I know that you've never heard the term over-recovery before, you also undergain because you missed a stimulus window. Many people look at it the other way. They'll tell you, hey, if you under-recover, you're going to undergain because you haven't recovered from the damage, so you're going to damage performance. But the opposite is also true. It is possible to over-rest. What is over-rest? You're resting from nothing. You're resting from damage that is non-existent or fatigue that has already subsided. So you're just wasting your time. But as I said, and it's something that I hope I'm going to go back to, most people like to espouse that because they tell themselves, well, at the end of the day, no harm, no foul. Worst case scenario, I just lost a tiny bit of gains, whereas the other scenario would be that I would have gotten an injury or I would have fried my CNS. That is not true. Again, it's absolutist. It's presenting a catastrophic outcome on one hand, and then a non-threatening outcome on the other hand, and saying to people, hey, pick one. Well, they'll always pick the one that's non-threatening. No one wants a catastrophe or a drama or something scandalous to happen in their life. But again, it's fear-mongering because it is absolutely much more difficult to overtrain than most people would actually think. Now, this means that you have to plan the program to always be able to train when possible, as this creates optimal recovery frequency. And that is also something that needs to be said. It's shocking to some, but a deload is not optimal recovery. A deload is absolute recovery. It's not the same, meaning that you will absolutely recover 100% from a deload. That is true. Your buckets will be full. Congratulations. But is that optimal? Maybe your buckets would have been full within 3 days. Maybe if you did a muscle split instead, you could have actually juggled the buckets and get them all to 100% while at the same time emptying other buckets and getting fatigue done, which then creates what? Hypertrophy and muscle gains. That is the point. That is optimal recovery frequency. Since yes, muscle is being built during the recovery windows, then you have to make sure that they occur as often as possible. This is only logical. But many people don't think about it that way. Many people don't think about it as, I will make sure to be able to recover as often as possible. They just tell themselves, I have to recover for a blanket amount of time, an arbitrary amount of time, and that is what is going to be optimal. It's not optimal again, it's absolute. And since quality recovery is recovery from muscle damage, as I said, it is therefore possible to say that improper deloads are low quality recovery, which damages long-term hypertrophy. Something that Alec pointed out as being fallacious. I don't know or understand why it could be fallacious. If you take a week off, you don't train, so you don't accumulate fatigue, and on top of that, you don't actually recover from substantial fatigue, how can you argue that this is not going to impact muscle gains, right? Unless you have, again, the type of approach that stipulates that it's not so bad to take a week off here and there, which I disagree with. Well, it's not something you can argue against. This is numerical values. I'm telling you that you're missing numbers, right? You're minus 2,000 on your bank account. You're not going to show up to the bank teller and say, well, I disagree with that. Like, you can't just do that. You can't say, well, I owe you $2,000. I disagree with those numbers. No, they're hard numbers. They're right there. You have to face them. That is why deloads tend to be subpar, is because they create a debt. They create a tonnage debt because you didn't get the work done and you recovered from nothing. So it's a period of detraining. A lot of people think they deload when in reality they detrain, and that is not the same, because you can only deload from a load. It's in the name. So if there is no load, no fatigue load, you're not deloading, you're just detraining. In opposition, you could be loading and still be deloading at the same time, because it's possible to recover from muscle damage while working out the muscles also at the same time. I said that in the CNS video. Now, these concepts are incredibly important to understand, right? For all of the people who think that a deload week is the only way to recover, keep in mind the concept of quality recovery, and keep in mind the concept also of improper deloads. The two go hand in hand. It doesn't mean that all deloads are improper, but those that are not actually deloads, as I already explained, damage long-term hypertrophy, and it's impossible to argue against that. Again, it's just mathematical. Now, this is why working smarter, not harder, most often means trying to use your smart to train as hard as possible. It's that false dichotomy I already pointed out with the gains happen when you go home and rest. The problem is that when you think about it this way, you lose sight of one of the two variables. On the first one, you lose sight? Yes. You lose sight of training because you over-obsess on recovery, which leads to poor recovery because you don't recover from training. Here, when you focus so much on working smarter, you forget about working harder. Now, my point is not to say that Jeff doesn't train hard, because I don't believe that. Also, it's a pet peeve of him, apparently, when people tell him he doesn't train hard. And I understand and argue and accept the fact that most people who point out at Jeff and say, you don't train hard enough, what they mean is, you don't train like a baboon, and therefore, I don't see you sticking up like rocks up your ass. So this means that you're not training hard because you must do what the other baboons do. No. When a pro bodybuilder tells you don't train hard enough, you have to carry that on your chest as a badge of honor. This means that you most likely have a proper way to train, because they train like complete morons, which means that by elimination, you train intelligently. But the problem is that you quickly find out that when someone says, I want to work smarter, or I work smarter than you, what they're really telling you is that they work harder, because the only goal of working smarter is the ability to work harder. It's what I already said. What is the goal of fatigue management? Fatigue management exists for the sole purpose of always making sure that the muscles are recovered, that they're never undertrained or overtrained. And that is the truth, which means what? You always want them to be at full capacity to be able to train hard. So working smart is working hard, but working hard is not necessarily working smart. Although if you do work hard, you will necessarily work smart. I hope that's clear. I told you we were going to get into semantical discussions and perspective shifts. For me, it fascinates me. I know that many people on the channel love that type of shit as well. I love it too, right? I love you guys, Jeff and Alec. I'm coming out of the closet. It's just such a great time to discuss these concepts with people who understand it. But I just want to bring a perspective to the discussion that I know you've never heard. So we're going to continue like this. But as I said, the goal is always to promote recovery as much as possible. So never overtrain, never undertrain. That is what we both want to do. Like the three of us, that's what we want. None of us doesn't want to do that. None of us doesn't want to work hard. None of us doesn't want to work smart, all right? That's the dick measuring contest that we already spoke about. The issue here is that Jeff is skewed towards the work smarter part. And that's not something you can argue against. Look at his channel. It's science-based, all of studies. He's very intelligent, all of diagrams, etc. That's great. It's high-quality content, the likes of which I cannot even touch. But the problem is that it is skewed towards the work smarter part, which means that he's losing sight on the work harder part, which should be the reason why you want to work smarter in the first place. And it also makes him skewed towards recovery, because many people who work smart obsess over recovery, and many people who work hard obsess over training. The two are unbalanced, but I have always found that obsessing over training allows you to actually obtain quality recovery, as I already presented. But in his case, it means that this might lead to him not working as hard as he could, and this is an hypothesis, I'm not saying that it's the case, but focusing on working hard doesn't have the same downsides. And that's the reason why I say focus on working hard, because when you work hard, the only way to actually train hard is to train smart. The other way is not true. You can train smart and not train hard, but you can't train hard and not train smart, because it's impossible to put in the work day in and day out without actually having smart practices put in place. Case in point, your servitor right there, and anyone who follows the same methods of Deloads. I train 6 days a week for hours with maximal loads and going to failure. You think I would be able to do that if the way I program is not smart? No. So I'm able to work hard because I work smart. But it's very dangerous to start with the work smart part, because it can lead to people not actually working as hard as they could. That is my argument. Now, if we're going to look at an example that Jeff presents for the people who work hard and not smart, he speaks about plateaus. And he says that many people who just want to work harder to break through a plateau will never actually do it, because the solution should have been to actually train smart. And the problem is that it's a different perspective again. A plateau for someone like a powerlifter will constitute inability to progress on the main lift, because the variable of intensity is fixated. So for undulating loads, for example, it creates a glass ceiling that prevents fatigue management from being optimal, and the end goal of hypertrophic strength, which means absolutely fucking nothing, I just made it up, it sounds cool, is not achievable, meaning that you cannot progress in strength. So a plateau in strength for a powerlifter is a tragedy. So they're going to focus all of their efforts on making sure that this doesn't happen. But for a bodybuilder, the only thing a plateau is it constitutes inability to progress on global tonnage for a movement pattern. This is when minimalism becomes maximalism. A powerlifter plateaus on one lift. A bodybuilder plateaus on movement patterns, meaning what? The powerlifter has a much stronger incentive to never plateau, because if they plateau on 100% of the movement. If I plateau on one of the movement patterns, it's like what, 20%? Example, a powerlifter plateaus on the bench. The bench is 100% or 90% or 80% of his horizontal press. The rest is variations. So it's fucking awful. He cannot have that stamped. I plateau on the bench, that's 20% of my global tonnage. The rest is variations that have more importance than the bench itself when looked at in their globality. So it's not as important anymore. That is a different standpoint and a different sensibility when related to plateaus. A plateau is not the same for a powerlifter and for a bodybuilder. And from what I just told you, it's much easier to plateau for a minimalist powerlifter than it is for a bodybuilder. I cannot tell you the last time I plateaued. All of my lifts progress. Do I mean that all of my lifts go up at all times? No, but one of them in the line of specificity at some point will go up. So I don't have to have the same practices as someone who absolutely needs to avoid plateau on one lift, because my method already includes enough lifts to make this entirely useless, which is why also deloads are not needed. We always go back to the deload topic. And this is what I just said. And the reaction to the plateau, or the preparation to avoid the plateau, will be entirely different. So we cannot expect powerlifters and bodybuilders to deload the same way. It is, again, insulting to just push deloads that were scheduled and created by strength athletes on bodybuilders and say, okay, you guys just do that shit. Like, we don't have time for you idiots. Just do that and you'll be fine. Like, well, you'll get 80% of the gains. Well, I want the 20% remaining, okay? So I'm going to make up a method that is going to give me those 20%. To continue with the work hard thing, I found it funny that Jeff would use Michael Jordan's footage when discussing why taking rest is important, because Michael Jordan was the perfect example of someone who worked hard. He didn't work smart. He was just what we call a workhorse. He would put in the work all the time. And he was, and he still is, the best basketball player of all time. Don't hate at me for it. If someone says LeBron in the comments, you are delusional. Now, at the end of the day, the issue with this training hard or training smart discussion is that it really boils down to a dick measuring contest. I already said that. But the problem is that when you have a dick measuring contest with someone, I'm sure that many of you have had that on a Tuesday morning. You are with your friends in a circle, you take out your dicks and you measure them. That's, of course, something that men do. It's very masculine. It's a rite of passage, as we say. When you engage in said dick measuring contest, You want to be the one with the big veiny dick. No one wants to have the tiny savant dick. What does that mean? Why did I just present an allegory that most likely made you cringe out of your breeches? Well, it's for a very simple reason. It's because you quickly find out that people who claim to train smart, actually what they are claiming to do is they're claiming to train hard, and that leads again to nonsensical discussions of back and forth between I train harder than you, no, I train harder. It don't matter. What matters is progression for different classes of people. And so it creates also an inversion of values in a sense, because people who claim to be training smart are in a sense trying to appropriate what training hard means. They're trying to replace the hard by the smart. But as I said, this creates overfocus and they lose sight of what training hard actually constitutes. Because at the end of the day, and it's something I said at the start too, we all agree on one thing: you have to train hard. And once you can get to that point and understand that, you're good. Alec wants you to train hard. Jeff wants you to train hard. I want you to train hard. But we all offer different perspectives on it. Why? Because we have different goals. That's it. It doesn't mean that one of us doesn't train hard. It means that we train hard for the practice that we pursue. Period. A chess player will work hard a different way than a mahjong or a gi player will work hard. Does it mean that one is right and the other one isn't? No, they have different goals. That's it. And you would see that actually. You would see that because the way a powerlifter trains and a strongman trains is different in terms of variables. You will never hear a strongman say that a powerlifter should train the way they train for powerlifting ever. Why? There is respect between them. There is no respect for bodybuilding. We are everyone's bitches. Again, it's our fault. We did that to ourselves, right? We fucked up, but I'm working hard to make sure that this state of affair changes and we can actually engage with other sports and other practitioners of lifting on an equal footing. It's going to take a few years, but we'll get there, guys. I promise you that natural bodybuilding will shine again, and people will stop making fun of you because you train for aesthetics. We're going to get there. Now, what looks like semantical differences are actually not semantical differences, because you might tell me, NH, you'll tell me that you agree with these guys almost 90%, and the rest is just like small perspective shifts. So why exactly is the point of paying attention to that? Well, one, because I already explained to you that these 10% are the vital 10%, but also because semantical differences lead to ideological differences. And it's something that Alec detected. He detected that my methods were ideologically opposed to his, but he didn't manage to connect that to differences in methodology, meaning that he still thought that his methodology was supreme. It's not. The different training styles that are being birthed by the different ideologies that actually segue from the semantical differences are the key. Too many people will tell you that semantical differences mean nothing and it's just hair splitting. It's true in some facets of life and science and philosophy, but in this case it's not. Language creates action, which creates the word. If you don't have language under control, you cannot control action, and you cannot create the word. It's incredibly important to understand. It's the reason why, by revamping the semantical approach to Deloads, I'm modifying the approach to training for bodybuilders, which in result should then lead to a better word for aesthetic bros everywhere. I am essentially the Martin Luther King of bodybuilding. Now, one thing that I don't agree with, and this time I 100% don't agree with because it's too far removed from what I believe is proper practices, is the fitness fatigue model. Now, this is a point of the video where if you're still there, you most likely either have a headache or you just want to quit. This might make you quit because it's the most complicated part of the video, but please bear with me because it's important. I'm going to check the time first. Okay, we can get through this. All right, I'm mostly going to be reading. So Jeff used the fitness fatigue model, which is in his video, you can check out, to explain, in a sense, his approach to Deloads. Now, the issue is that the vast majority of exercise science studies, just like this fitness fatigue model, are modeled after strength sports. And that is true almost 100% of the time. When someone makes a sport exercise science study, most of the time what they have in mind is not bodybuilding and it's not hypertrophy. It's function and it's strength. This is incredibly important because I see too many people citing studies saying, oh, this proves that this lift is the best for hypertrophy. The study wasn't conducted for hypertrophy's sake. It was conducted for function. And the two don't correlate. They work hand in hand, one pushes the other, but they're not one-to-one. If you don't understand that, it will be really tough to understand why bodybuilding is in such a poor shape and why most bodybuilders have shit physiques. It's because we espouse scientific studies that were not created with us in mind. It's the equivalent of if a surgeon for humans started to look at studies made by veterinarians about horses and dogs and started to apply their surgical practices after that study. It would be catastrophic because even though there are some correlations, you're working on completely different entities. It's the same with that fitness fatigue model study that Nippard showed. I put in parentheses again because it obsesses me, but the reason why is because bodybuilding is the ugly duckling ever since PDs came over, so no one even bothers making studies for us because we don't matter. I already told that. Now, this means, that sort of affair, that there is a clear bias towards performance, right? And it's proven by the model. I looked at the model, I studied it for hours. This model lumps both strength and muscle in the fitness category, which is already a no-no. You're not supposed to do that. They're not the same variables. The only reason why they did that is because they look at hypertrophy as a byproduct of strength, which again is disrespectful towards hypertrophy training and bodybuilding, but they don't care. So that's already the first problem. Fitness is too broad of a category to put both size and strength in. It makes no sense. It also offers no distinction between peripheral and central categories for fatigue, meaning that it takes into account muscle and CNS fatigue in the same column, which is also not proper. They should be split because these variables don't evolve at the same rate, they don't recover at the same rate. And they also fail to distinguish between the type of movement that has the strongest influence on it. So this is also incredibly important because if you're going to discuss fatigue, you have to have the ability to discuss the impact and influence of several different muscle movement patterns on said fatigue. If you don't take that into account, it's going to be very difficult to actually manage fatigue accordingly. The model also fails to distinguish between, the model also fails to take into account that for the performance metric, this metric can exist on varying levels that depend on intent. Bodybuilders don't need to be fully performant at all times. It's the metaphor of the bucket I'd already described when I talk about Alec, and the reason why bodybuilders don't need the bucket to be at 100%, meaning that we, bodybuilders, can prioritize fitness and therefore have a different take on fatigue. You know what I'm going to do? In the pinned comment, I'm going to, I can't because I'm already using the pinned comment. No, in the pinned comment, I will put both the CNS video and I will put my entire script. It's written by an unhinged French person, so it's going to be very confusing, but that way you can read it because I know that this is very complicated stuff and it makes sense to me because it's me that produces it, it's in my brain, but I want you to understand it because it's key. Like people ask me all the time, what is the difference between strength and size? That's it, right there. That fitness model is the perfect explanation as to why size and strength are different, because it seeks to promote both, but it only promotes one, and it treats the other one as a byproduct. Now, I also disagree with the take of Nippard on the model, where he says that fitness is the good stuff, while fatigue is the bad stuff. This is, again, a viewpoint that hyper-focus on one of two variables without taking into account the interconnection between the two, meaning that there is going to be a certain demonization and diabolization of fatigue, which is a bad thing because without fatigue, you cannot get fitness. It's the same way with working hard, working smart, or with training and recovery. It's the egg and the chicken metaphor I already explained. To get the good stuff, you have to accept the bad stuff. If you don't, you might not get as much as the good stuff as you ultimately could. By this, I am not saying that Nippard doesn't understand the amount of importance fatigue has on fitness accumulation. He knows it. What I'm saying is that he, in a sense, underestimates how much fatigue one can get to get similar results in terms of fitness gains. That is the point. And the issue with that take is that when you interpret the model in this fashion, you end up with takes and with outcomes and pearls of wisdom that you offer to your audience that are skewed. For example, a quotation I have from Jeff here is that if fitness and fatigue are both high, performance will suffer. That is him interpreting the model, all right? We're getting to scientific details and nitty-gritties of, again, scientific method, but my issue with this take is very simple, and you'll be able to understand it. It's twofold. One, fatigue and fitness grow together as one causes the other, and vice versa. However, they do not grow at the same rate. We also know from the opening statements of the study that fatigue decays fast and fitness decays slowly. So to make you visualize the graph, if you don't have it in mind, this is fatigue, this is fitness. Jeff tells you that if they're both here, then the third column of performance is going to be lower. My point is that since these two don't grow at the same rate or lower at the same rate, the possibility of them having them both at the same level is one, highly improbable, and two, is not going to actually last in time. Fatigue is going to go down, performance will go back up, fitness will have barely moved, which means that, again, the method of trying to just flush all of that deload to promote performance going back up is unnecessary, because you could just flush it here and still get performance increases. That is the point. I'm going to continue with my breakdown of the scientific method here. No. On the graph shown, I already described to you, since they are both at the same level, the fitness and the fatigue, and since we know that fatigue will return to baseline faster, this pretty much proves that any practice aimed at achieving pure fatigue deload, so only looking at the column of fatigue and saying, okay, I want this to go down as much as possible for performance to go up, and therefore fitness to go up, has a strong chance of going overboard and causing fitness to lower down instead. That is my point. It's what I've always repeated with my take on deloads, is that my issue is that people over-focus on fatigue. They want it to go down so much that inadvertently what they create is they create a vacuum for fatigue. Well, no fatigue occurs, and when no fatigue occurs, what happens? Fitness either stagnates or it regresses. And yes, it might be small, but we're talking about optimization here, so you can't ignore it. Fitness will, yes, remain stable, and it regresses much slower than fatigue, but that shouldn't be an excuse to not have it keep growing. If anything, it should be a way to actually utilize that stability to use the variable of fatigue to constantly prop it up. And of course, it's only realistic to an extent, because there will have to be recovery times allocated to fatigue management. But as I said, they can be approached with a different method, one that is more precise, one that is less absolutist, and it's the one that I offered with my method of deloads. So that is for the first take. I think I had one last line. So as I said on the graph, that yes, we can, any practice aimed at achieving pure fatigue deload has a strong chance of going overboard and causing fitness to go down instead, seeing as how fitness gets boosted by fatigue accumulation followed by recovery periods. So to finish with that point, since it's fitness that creates, since it's fatigue accumulation and flush and periods of accumulation and flush, which we call recovery, training and recovery, that creates fitness, it is always going to be better to look at fatigue as a metric that must be accumulated and not flushed in order to actually bolster fitness and to bolster performance. That is the way to approach recovery. I hope I am clear. I apologize if I'm not clear. Number two of my takes on Nippard's interpretation of the fitness fatigue model is that, to quote him, if fitness and fatigue are both high, performance will suffer. That to me is a conflation of two parameters. What causes performance to suffer is high fatigue. High fitness is just a consequence of the former. This isn't just nitpicking. The point is that you can maintain high fitness with moderate to low fatigue, which then also promotes performance, which in turn allows to accumulate fatigue and promotes fitness. If fatigue is low, fitness will suffer. Low performance is only a problem if it makes accumulating fatigue impossible, which is why focusing on fitness as the end goal makes more sense. I hope this makes sense. This is an extrapolation on take number one. I explained to you why take number one was faulty, and now I show you why, and I give you a way out. I explain to you what my take is. And I'm not saying here that I'm correct. I'm just saying that that's what I believe to be correct. There is a difference. This is, of course, only my opinion, my dear friends. I'm not a scientist. I don't have Jeff Nippard's credential, or whoever made the study, they're all much more diplomed than I am. I'm just a guy who is telling you that, to me, that doesn't make any sense for hypertrophy. Because my goal is, of course, to always maintain high fitness, and I also never want fatigue to go all the way down because it's entirely useless. You never want the bucket to be all the way down. You want it to be always low to moderately loaded, because this is the best way to keep fatigue accumulation going, which keeps fitness accumulation growing as well. And performance is only something that allows to accumulate fatigue. So I never look at performance as a metric that I want to bolster. Performance is only there to help me get fatigue up. Powerlifters don't think like this because it doesn't work for them. They never want fatigue to impede performance. I never want performance to impede fatigue. That's different, but we're going to get into that because I have a formula to offer to you once I finish recapping what I just said, because I know that just reading it is not enough for many people. It wasn't even enough for me because even I didn't understand 100% of what I said. Now, low performance, as I said, is only a problem if it makes accumulating fatigue impossible, and it's why I focus on fitness. And so I offer to you my formula, a formula that was dictated in the studies where they said that fitness minus fatigue equals performance, which clearly shows that they're skewed towards performance. I say, and I offer to you a different formula for bodybuilding, which is performance minus fatigue equals fitness. The prior formula seeks to maximize performance by prioritizing fitness. Mine seeks to maximize fitness by prioritizing performance. They are different. And in both cases, you see that performance is a byproduct of fatigue accumulation, in my case, and in the case of powerlifters, it's the other way around, because the only reason why you would want to have performance as the primary resulting factor of a fitness fatigue model is because it's your main priority. And whose main priority is performance? Strength athletes, not bodybuilder. This is proven by the fact that Jeff explains the concept of fatigue impacting performance by using the example of someone who maxes out on Monday and Tuesday. From this example, I have 2 points to make. One, why would they max out if they're a bodybuilder, knowing and seeing that maxing out and one rep max at 100% is completely subpar for hypertrophy? Because if we look at the model again, what a one rep max is tons of fatigue that accumulates at a very fast rate, really high, and forces you to deload afterwards for minimal strength gains of fitness. It's always better for fitness and for bodybuilders to stay between 70-90% and get your fitness up like this, because the higher the bucket raises, the higher the fatigue is, the slower it's going to go back down, and the slower it flushes. It's the reason why also bodybuilders need to have a more minute approach to fatigue. Powerlifters have to have a more absolutist approach to fatigue. It's, again, different concepts altogether. A practice that damages performance for subpar fatigue is not a practice that is going to result in any hypertrophic fitness. And the second one is that, yes, someone not being able to replicate performance is going to be tragical for a powerlifter. I already explained that. But it's not a sign of lost fitness, and Jeff makes that point. He understands that. He's not stupid. He knows that you don't just magically lose strength or muscle. What happens in reality is that it's a sign of high fatigue. It's the reason why you cannot max out every single day. At some point, you lose performance because fatigue is too high. But the issue, and this is when we differ, is that this doesn't necessitate a deload to fix. And it's a point I already made in the segment about Alec. It could also mean that you accumulated too much fatigue for your good. So the problem is poor fatigue management to start with, which a deload cannot fix. It's the same with tendon pain. You have tendon pain. A deload might help you, but the problem wasn't the deload. The problem was the way you trained prior to it. And Jeff says that once that fatigue dissipates, that high fatigue I just described, via a deload in his case, you'll see the gains you made and keep pushing forward. The problem, and that's something I already said, but it's the most important point of the video, is that fatigue can dissipate as you accumulate fatigue on another movement pattern. And the only way to counter the argument is to say CNS. I already proven to you that the CNS is not going to be a limiting factor in that practice, because it's a bucket, just like another bucket. It can be managed. You can flush out, and this is, again, I have great metaphors in this video. We talked about veiny dicks, now we're going to talk about shit. You can flush out fatigue while still taking a shit. You can flush the toilet while still taking a shit if you're doing the proper splits. Yes, I'm taking the metaphor that far, but that's my point. you can manage fatigue with a muscle split if you know what you're doing and never actually need a deload. That is it. How long do we have? Okay, we should be able to finish with this one take. All right. So, this means that saying that performance drives both strength and size is correct in a vacuum, but when applied to people in particular, meaning that when you make a study that is supposed to apply to a general audience, it stops making sense because powerlifters use fatigue to drive performance, bodybuilders use performance to drive fatigue. One programs with fatigue in mind so as to always promote performance. The other will constantly look for opportunities to perform so as to accrue fatigue. This is the difference. And I understand that when someone says, what is the difference between size and strength training? If you give them the definition I just gave you, they're not going to like it because it's too complicated. But that's it. That's the reality. That's it. You have it now. So stop asking the question. Now, understanding it is a different concept altogether. But I would tell you that most of the time, it's easier to understand that type of advanced concept when you practice them with your body. That's a discussion with another time. It's the reason why I don't like the scientific inclined YouTube fitness is because it fails to take into account practice. But to understand better the naturalistic differences between powerlifters and bodybuilders, by scoping down a powerlifter, aka a minimalist, by trade, powerlifters and strength athletes are minimalists by trade because they have to be. A minimalist, a powerlifter, make it so that their fatigue management must be much more precise in the sense that any small deviation can create big variance in terms of performance, which is why undershooting fatigue is always favored as opposed to overdoing it. It's incredibly important to understand that. If powerlifting occurs here, this is the minimalist household. You understand that if this square foot is occupied, even if outside of the scale of this box, it's not that much, it's still like 20% of the box. So it's a lot. A minimalist cannot allow that level of small details to go unnoticed or to not be able to control them to that level. So what's going to happen is that they're going to make sure that any variation is as limited as possible in terms of fatigue, meaning that they will always try to get fatigue to 100% because it reduces the risk of not being able to perform optimally. That's the key to high performance for powerlifters. And it's the reason why, as I said, they tend to undershoot fatigue. Powerlifters will always prefer to be less fatigued because therefore they are more performant. Bodybuilders are the opposite. We will always prefer to be less performant if it allows us to be more fatigued. That is the way to think about it. That is because we are not minimalists, which is why powerlifters will always underdo it sometimes with underloading loads or modified percentages on purpose because it works for them for performance, but the same mindset doesn't work for bodybuilders because our empirical experience of training shows that maximalists, on the other hand, find out that there is no real risk or cost associated with overdoing it a bit, because the only thing that overdoing it does for us is we lose a bit of performance. So next time we'll know better. But even if we did lose the performance, if we allow ourselves to repeat cycles of recovery because we overdid it a bit, then it's still beneficial for us. Again, I hope that this is clear. But it's the difference between, again, a minimalist and a maximalist. A maximalist is going to be able to take that type of risk because for us, it's what makes the most sense. However, there can be severe repercussions if they underdo it as their scope is much larger. For the metaphor again, this is a minimalist, this is a maximalist. For a minimalist, because the box is so small, any small factor in the box needs to be looked at, and you cannot have a factor of fatigue that is too big because it hurts performance. For a maximalist, it's the opposite. You do want to paint with a broader brush because the box is huge. So for a maximalist, the problem is not going to be, am I going to fill up the box to the point that I'm going to start to go outside of it and therefore overshoot? It's more, I can't allow myself to undershoot because the box is already so big. The box represents all of the muscles you have to hit and the methods and the reps and the sets. That is the difference. This is my personal favorite metaphor to create a distinction in the mind of people between powerlifters and bodybuilders. Minimalists between maximalists. Different methods for different folks for different purposes. Now, this is why, as I said, bodybuilders also tend to do more junk volume on average, or why they tend to use more volume, or also, and this is my favorite take, why PED users' programs are so idiotic. PED users understand what I say even if they can't intellectualize it, and it's the reason why they do so much, because they want to fill up the box. And if a natural bodybuilder's box is this is a PED user. They have much more capacity for work, right? So this means that, yes, they're going to try and get as much as possible. Does it mean they work harder? Because I already see people say, well, it proves that PED users work harder. No, because they don't work smart. I already said that. They just do more work. But then you take that massive ass box and you give it to a natural bodybuilder. His box is like this. You don't have the work capacity or even the ability to handle that amount of fatigue. So you burn out. It's the reason why, again, PED users make terrible bodybuilding programs, and also why, if I take the same box of bodybuilding and I stick it in front of the minimalist box, a minimalist cannot train like that because it greatly exceeds the boundaries of what his sport necessitates. Which is also why, when you take a minimalist mindset and you plug it in the maximalist box of bodybuilding, now you only do 30% of the work. It cannot logically be better. You're doing less work. You only think it's better because it works for you. That's something I already covered with Alec, but it's important to repeat. So I hope that this was clear. This is as clear as I can get. And this means that, yes, deloads can be useful for both powerlifters and bodybuilders, but the second can't just be an afterthought of the first. Powerlifting is its own sport, and so is bodybuilding, so we're going to have different methods, something that I proved lengthily. And this means that this makes the standard deload presented by Jeff as the closest thing in existence to a bodybuilding deload, while you moderately decrease both volume and intensity throughout the weeks. Although, in my version of the bodybuilding deload, the moderation would be extremely small, meaning that we would be even more moderate than the most moderate of moderate. And this would mean that every single week is a bodybuilding deload week, meaning that every single time you program with in mind the fact that there needs to be those differences on every single day for every single program, for every single movement, for your fatigue management, because you have a much broader range of things to control, and therefore it's not going to be proper to just use a big deload. It's something I already explained. The standard deload, as such, is going to occur through the evolving reps, the sets, and the rotations, which allows for slight modifications of volume, intensity, and frequency while keeping tonnage relatively stable, or allowing for sacrifices if needed. And that is the fatigue management plan and method that I described. That way you always do relevant work and alternate between fatigue and recovery for each muscle. If that sounds shadowy and obscure, video in the description. I explain everything and every concept I use for deloads in the description. So that's going to be that. That concludes the video. I had a good time. I don't know if this makes any sense to anyone outside of me. I hope it does. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed it. I want to thank Alec and Jeff for their videos. High quality again, intelligent guys, good points. As I explained, it's a different of perspective. I'm bringing in the natural bodybuilding perspective that needs to make a resurgence on the platform. And I thank again these guys because they allow for conversation with their great videos, and conversation, as we all know, leads to progress, and progress leads to evolution. And that's what we need. We need more evolution. We need more discussions on YouTube Fitness. More people willing to clash and confront their thoughts to actually create something new from them. So this is also why this video is going to be the end of that deload discussion, because I said whatever I could say. If either of these dudes wants to debate me so that we can create something and not just have a fight and a dick measuring contest, I would be absolutely open to that. I would even be open to debating the two at the same time, because as we all know, I am French, and the French are not afraid of a little ménage à trois. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.